I want to sort of set the environment of what it was like in the late 60s and 70s, what this movement emerged from. It was a time of great social change movements, of the civil rights movement, of African Americans and women and gays and people with physical disabilities, great turmoil, great organizing for social change. For decades, this is the words, we used to use mental patient as a word because we were trying to resurrect it as a good thing. So some of the language in here is from some of the language that we used then. But we were denied basic civil liberties and really did suffer inhumane treatments. Once you were in a state hospital, you could spend your lifetime there and die there. But something started happening at the end of the 1960s, 70s, is these state hospitals were being closed. And something else also began to happen is commitment laws started getting tighter. I think California was the first with the Letterman-Petra Short Act in 1969. So less people were going in the hospitals and people were exiting hospitals. I don't know, I haven't seen this written down except from me, but anecdotally, I know that as people left, they started meeting with each other outside hospitals. They started talking to each other. They didn't have nurses around or clinicians around, and they started validating each other in terms of their feelings of outrage of what had happened to them. At that time, Thorazine and Stelazine were the drugs that were being used and horribly overused, shock treatment. And so people would start talking about that, the way you're walking and your stiffness, that's not your mental illness, which is what we had been told. That's the effects of the drugs. So we started educating each other. And really, out of these sort of meetings emerged this consumer, what I call really a liberation movement. It was really, for me, and it has always been, and it is to this day, a part of the civil rights movement. We are a civil rights movement. I want to talk a little bit about how I got here, because it was in the 1970s, became part of this movement. I ended up in a mental health facility, not in my late teens or early 20s, it was my early 30s, and had spent a long time, 4 or 5 or 6 years of just isolating and daydreaming. And one day I woke up and didn't know who I was. I knew that people said my name was Sally Zinman, and I could even repeat where I went to college and all those kinds of facts about Sally Zinman, but it wasn't me. And I made a mistake of telling my father and mother they were very nice people, but they weren't my parents. And soon after, I found myself in a mental health facility. It was an outpatient facility. At that time, it didn't matter if you were in a state hospital or in a private hospital, the treatment was pretty much the same. At one point, and this is more than 40 years ago, it's like 45 years ago, I was and I can feel myself getting upset right now about it, feeling it right now. I was in a cellar, what they called a security room in an old farmhouse. This doctor had a farm in which he had the main house and had different houses on the land where his patients were and where therapists lived with the patients. It sounds ideal, it wasn't. And for what they call security room or quiet room or isolation, solitary confinement, they built a room in the basement of this old farmhouse. So I was in this basement. The lock was a 2x4 on the door. Then there was a little window or opening at the top. I was in my bra and pantyhose the whole time. I had a mattress on the floor and a bucket to go to the bathroom. It was 3 months. I was allowed to go up to the main bathroom to shower in the morning, and I was escorted by 2 aides, a man and a woman, and they stayed in the bathroom with me. And I too, like Judy Chamberlain, remember saying to myself, I can't do anything about this now. I was too confused and disoriented myself to be able to do anything about it. But I'll be back someday to change this. The ticket to get out of that cellar was to say my name was Sally Zinman. So after 3 months, I did what was, quote, appropriate in the environment. I didn't believe it. I still didn't know who I was, and I was guessing that I was famous people. But I said what they wanted me to say. And I got out of the cellar, and eventually I got privileges, and eventually I got out of the facility. But I left with the same problem I had when I went in, except it was worse. Because added to that was the oppression of the experience that I had had.
Wow, a lot has changed since Sally had those horrifying experiences. And every time I hear her story, I just feel terrible about what she had to go through. And she's not, she wasn't the only one. She's just the voice of people who've had those kind of experiences. Could Sharon Carroll tell us a little bit about your experience in recovery? Maybe you want to start, Sharon?
Sure. Yes.
Okay.
Like Sally and others who were earlier in the movement, I also had an experience of forced hospitalization and really heavy drugging that took me a long time to recover from. But how I ended up in that hospital is that I was a young mother and going through hormonal changes and also dealing with a pretty abusive relationship. So I kind of busted out of that relationship and found myself, locked up in Willard State Hospital, which is the state psychiatric hospital in Ovid, New York. And that was a really scary place to be. I mean, I wasn't, I did have some covering, but I was in a gown that was open in the back because they didn't have clothes that fit me. I was really confused and scared, and I was locked into a seclusion room where I was molested and sexually used by some of the mental hygiene assistants. So I was so horrified the whole time I was there. I was very lucky because I worked in a sort of a hippie restaurant, and some of my friends came to visit me, and sort of that connection with the community, I think, helped me get out. But it was a very scary place to be. And I did have my first contact with someone from the consumer movement while I was there. George Ebert, who ran the Mental Patients Liberation Alliance in New York, came to see me. It was 1984 when I was in Willard. And it was very exciting to talk to someone who could actually validate my okayness.
Yes.
And he said to me, Sharon, you're not crazy. It's a crazy world. And that was really pivotal in my beginning to take myself back.
Yes. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Um, I went from there. I wasn't ready to be an activist, but I spent about 10 years just taking care of my daughter, taking care of my home, getting off the heavy drugs, and sort of working out my relationship with who I was. And I kept on asking the question, what helps people heal? What helps me heal? So that was my recovery. Really continued over a long time, but it was expedited when I got involved in the movement and met people like Mary Ellen Copeland and Jay Mahler and started actually being part of a bigger movement.
I remember you in those days. In fact, Sharon, you and I went through rap training together.
I know, Lori. I
Yeah.
was thinking about that too. The first time I met you was
Yes.
back in Vermont with Mary Ellen Copeland.
Yes. Yes. And
Yeah.
then I was connected with Jay. I was the first patients' rights advocate at a state level. And Jay was so happy about that because he knew me, he knew I would have integrity around that. And then he started
Ah,
introducing me to you folks in the Bay Area that were doing amazing, amazing advocacy work. I just want to circle back to something you said. You know, that fellow that visited you in the hospital,
Oh,
you know, I think
George.
that was probably the most healing thing that happened to remind
Oh,
you of who you are. You know, not a
absolutely.
mental patient. You're,
Absolutely. Because
yeah,
no one else was validating anything that I was saying or doing. So that was just like, oh, it was like a foot on the floor, on the
yes.
ground, you know? I mean, it was just amazing.
And there's nothing that I can think of that is more degrading or disempowering than to be sexually molested.
Oh,
You know, of all the things you didn't need in your treatment setting, it was that.
absolutely. Absolutely. I sort of sum it up as from abuse to abuse. I mean, a
Yes,
system that gives you more of what you're trying to get away from.
yes,
Yeah,
yes.
not, I mean, it really did create a fire in me
Mhm.
that, I'm really committed to figuring out how this doesn't happen for people,
Yeah.
how we do something much different than this.
And I just want to say, and I'd like people to, I want to send people to your website for the work amazing work you do now. So let's get that and Jean will put it on the screen so we can include that.
Great.
Yeah, yeah. And Carol, you were right there on the ground with Sharon and Sally during the were you there during the 80s too? Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your story.
So I actually first got hospitalized in 73, but it was in California. So we had the Community Mental Health Act. So they were really working to have community centers in the community. And also LPS, Lernerman Petra Short, had gone into effect. So you didn't have indefinite stays or stays that were as long as your insurance covered. There had to be, they had criteria, dangerous to self, dangerous to others, gravely disabled. And I believe I got hospitalized because I was gravely disabled. Um, and I got, you know,
Just take a second here because some of our audience might not know what that means. So, am I right in saying it means someone decides that you can't provide food, clothing, or shelter for yourself? Is that part of the definition?
that's correct. And sometimes in California nowadays, someone who's homeless doesn't automatically qualify as gravely disabled.
Yeah,
It's that you have housing and you're not using it. You
yeah,
have
okay.
clothing, you're not using it, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
they at the time they told me, oh, you would, if you were put on a strange corner in a strange city that you are so gravely disabled, you would probably commit a crime or be the victim of a crime in short order.
That's how they described it, explained it to you?
Yeah, yeah. So ended up spending about a week in the hospital when it was all said and done. And I have to say, I was afraid of molestation. You're given they take your clothes and they give you a gown that has an opening in the back, and it's a co-ed unit. I mean, like, hey, what's going on? And I can remember three guys coming up to me. When this was at one point, I still had my clothes on. They told me to drop my pants. And I mean, it was terrifying. I was like, why? Well,
Yeah.
they wanted to give me an injection.
Oh,
Um, and it's kind of the hospitalization. I mean, I had more than one hospitalization. I went three times. And, there were things like I had face cleaner that was in a glass jar. And so it had to be locked up. And so I had to finally figure out that I had to go between 8:30 or 7:30 and 8 o'clock to ask to be able to access it for no more than half an hour. I mean, it was kind of things like that that made you feel very out of control in some
yeah,
ways.
yeah. You were out of control. I
Yeah.
mean, you might have been in control, but you had no control over your situation at that point.
That's true. That's
Yeah.
true. So I ended up in a halfway house at one point, and that's when I met Jay Mahler. He came and talked
Mhm.
about gathering up mental health clients and, working to change the system. And he had actually been in the local newspaper with his picture saying that he was a mental patient. I was going like, oh, I don't know. This is kind of scary, you know? And so it took me several years to really kind of get around to the point where I wanted to really join up and be active.
Yeah.
But it made a whole big difference. I was involved in the forming of the San Francisco network of mental health clients and
Oh,
doing things I'd never done before. And, we put on a conference and we started a drop-in center, and it really, was very empowering.
At any rate, so I settled on a farm. I settled on a farm in a place called Loxahatchee, Florida. And probably as part of my recovery is I created an organic vegetable farm. And business didn't do very well, but I ate well. And I learned how to sew, and I learned how to build things. I built a chicken coop. I just sort of got back to the earth and was there from 1973 to almost 1980. 1977 was a real change in my life. And actually, good food and lots of bags full of vitamins and exercise really was part of my individual recovery. But I also did a lot of soul searching as what had happened to me and did come up with my own values about forced treatment. And I wanted to start a mental patient group. I wanted to start a group of mental patients that would advocate for other mental patients. I didn't know there were such things around the country. And I found out that there were groups like that around the country, exactly like I wanted to start in this little place called Loxahatchee, Florida, that had ABC names for its roads and bumpy dirt roads. I found out about this International Conference on Human Rights and Against Psychiatric Oppression, and I went, on my own dime. And that was my aha moment. That was my moment that I knew that I was no longer alone. Everybody has them at different times, in different places. It can be a little conference, it can be a big conference, it can be a peer support training. I've heard people walking out of peer support training saying, this is it. I'm no longer alone. I was no longer alone. There were people that had been through the same thing I had. There were people who had come to the same conclusions I had. I remember when I came home, a neighbor said, you look like you're in love or you're getting married. And yes, I was in love and I did get married, and I got married to this movement and this cause. As we talked about Madness Network News, there are small groups, mostly on the two coasts, although occasionally they were in between where there happened to be an activist. And look at the names. Network Against Psychiatric Assault, Insane Liberation Front, Mental Patient Liberation Front. I'm the director of a group called California Association of Mental Health Peer-Run Organizations. That is not the same kind of name. So you could tell by the names the militancy. Our most common self-description was psychiatric inmate, because we had felt that we were just like any other inmate in a prison or where we had been in hospitals. There was also a lot of support and consciousness raising. This is a book, I don't know if people have heard about it, called On Our Own, Patient-Controlled Alternatives to the Mental Health System. I think it was written in 1978, but it is as true today as it was then, although the language is sort of a little dated. There, in the book, near the end, there are 7 bullet points of what a consumer-run, peer-run program should be, and it really defines peer support. It's quite incredible. And for some reason, you never know what it's going to be. This book was a landmark book because it opened up the mind of the decision makers, the power and think brokers in the mental health system. Especially this community support program under National Institute of Mental Health that started supporting consumers and consumer-run programs and put out policy papers across the country saying that consumers and family members should be part of decision-making, and consumer-run programs should be part of every continuum in the community. It was that book that broke it open.
I was really touched by the book On Our Own. Um, it really spelled out how to create a peer consumer-run program and how to be very different than what the system was doing to us. And it really was very empowering. And it also, brought out the idea of shared leadership, that we are all leaders, and, how important that can be to prevent the system from co-opting you or taking you over, um, and controlling you. And I think a lot of the early peer self-help was really about really taking power over your own self and your own life, your own choices, and not being controlled, even if it was benevolently by, people meaning to help you, but it was really finding your own way.
And for me personally, she meant a lot to me in our personal interactions and the ways that she demonstrated the true meaning of friendship, non-judgment, and true peer support. I first met Sally when I was a student and doing research on how people in recovery could position themselves in the movement to make the biggest change. So I was really looking at where is there the best leverage. And so I interviewed Sally at the Berkeley Drop-In Center in 1996, and I was just so moved by her. Over the years, when I eventually moved to Oakland, she was a safe house for me. So the true total mutuality, peer support of a peer who is there for you, does not judge you. I mean, I actually like to call her my other mother because my mother's name is Sally.
Oh, what?
And Sally Zinman was, of course, more like a friend than a mother, but she was so amazing in her way that she could be non-judgmental and just clear and just supportive. I went through periods of time where it was very difficult for my family to accept my behavior or what I was doing and acting. And they would be urging me to go to the hospital, take some very, very strong antipsychotics and things like that. But Sally was able to just make a place for me at her house where I could be and to just give me gentle guidance that I could totally accept because of the type of relationship that we had, and that what we call in IPS, or intentional peer support, we call it relational safety. When someone can actually just kind of create that healing space with you where you're not being judged, and you're kind of just going through it, and they believe that you're going to come out the other side.
Yes, powerful. Relationship is what makes it all work anyway. We have
Clearly.
people have the courage to get in relationship with us. Then that's when the healing can start.
Absolutely. And Sally had a stone on her like kitchen windowsill that had etched in it, "Friends are our chosen family." And that saying has just carried with me in my life of just like thinking about who is my family. It's the people that I can create that kind of relationship with.
You had a lot of almost family relationship with Sally also, Carol, as I recall.
Did. Yeah, I remember particularly her birthday parties where we would all get together. But you're talking about a sense of family, and I
Mhm.
do have a sense of the movement being my family,
Mhm.
and that I don't always have to like talk to them every day or write letters or whatever, but they're there when you need them, and you're there for them.
Mhm. Mhm.
And, there was that sense around Sally, definitely. And she also talks about she was married to the movement.
Hmm.
About
That,
that.
she worked pretty much to her very last day,
Mhm.
on stuff related to fighting, the expansion of forced treatment.
Mhm.
And,
Mhm. Mhm.
yeah.
I just want to say a bit here about leadership. to our audience, if you're in a leadership position, listen up to this, because this relational type of leadership is so impactful and is so focused on growth and development as opposed to control and manage. So much effective with everybody, not just peers, but everybody, but especially with peers. So just want to point that out, how powerful that can be.
That just along those same lines, I got to partner and sort of observe her working with like all the different leaderships of the organizations that represent constituents or consumers, family members, children, in the Working Well Together collaborative. And it was so amazing because we worked so closely with people whose viewpoints about things that were happening in the mental health system were diametrically opposed, and yet we still focused together on what it took to be a good peer support specialist, or how certain things should be handled in terms of employing people in recovery. And so I just was wowed by Sally's like authentic persistence of showing up. Her values never wavered, but she was still able to navigate, learn, grow, and effectively partner with people that were very, very different in what they were hoping to achieve. It was pretty amazing.
Amazing strength. Right. Yes. Okay, let's move on and hear a little more clip from Sally.
As I said, that this federal government, the community support program under NIMH, really, really was supportive. And without that, those power brokers providing that support, maybe some of this growth would not have occurred. They funded 13 demonstration projects throughout the country of consumer-run programs. It was the beginning of statewide organizations, as I had said. But I also talked about the shifts and the discontinuation of things. And they are not by accident. Madness Network News stopped publishing in about 1986 as these new endeavors were flourishing or beginning to come into existence. The Conference on Human Rights and Psychiatric Oppression, the last one was in 1985, and the first Alternatives was in 1985. That is not an accident. It was literally that the old ways of organizing were no longer necessary. They had sort of made ways for what was happening today and for new ways of organizing. There were huge, by the way, growth in rights protections. The protection and advocacy began, I think, in the late 1980s, which, as you know, is now, I guess, disability rights. They've changed their name, but it's it's a federally mandated state program to protect the rights of people with lived experience, among other things. And we were beginning to walk more inside and talking about social change from the inside as well as the outside. We are also beginning to follow these trends, is what I was talking about. We began to sit, three things. Everything was about us without us. We started sitting on boards and commissions and decision-making bodies. It was limited. I remember in the 1980s in California fighting to have two consumers on what in California they call mental health boards and commissions. And now 50% of every mental health board and commission has to be family members or consumers. So it was limited, but we were beginning to not only get in the room, but sit at the table. So this is a picture I'm sort of going to lump the 90s, and I'm going to lump everything to today, the next 3 decades, because in some ways they are really based on that shift that occurred in 1980, that shift of moving forward, of taking money, of funding organizations and programs, of hiring staff, of re-entering the world, of forming collaborations, of walking inside the avenues of power instead of standing outside with placards. I think that we have to go back a little more to that today, but it was a big shift. This is a demonstration on the Capitol grounds in California. Actually, and it was, as many of you had maybe in your states, sort of days in which clients or consumers, however you define yourself, gather in your capital and visit legislators. We started getting what we wanted. We started seeing really the fruition of changes that we had sought in the mental health system. In my opinion, the basic values remain the same, but they really start getting rephrased in recovery language as what we're for, not what we're against. And they're not as militant. There are so many consumer-run survivor programs, employment, educational opportunities, and the other strand I asked you to think about and remember, recovery. There was a person there named Bill Anthony from the Center for Rehabilitation in Boston University that defined the 1990s as the decade of recovery. The concept of recovery started entering within the mental health system, where it is the expectation isn't a lifetime of chronicity. The expectation is recovery, that everybody diagnosed with a mental illness can recover. Simple, clear, but it was such a shift. It is so different. And I might be accused of being consumer-centric, but I know that it came from that advocacy. I know that it came from consumers. We all knew that we got better because we got better. So let's go over some of these changes. So, the big difference is just fascinating is employment, in addition to consumer-run programs in the mental health system of peer supporters and peer providers. That was a change of a value that we would not have had that value or that principle or that goal sitting in those campgrounds because the mental health system was our enemy. But as we started changing, as the gains started happening, as the old ways of organizing ended and new ways took its place, that became a new goal of employment, of changing the system, of being change agents, of working within the system, of having your day job be your advocacy or be your peer support, of not just informally meeting with peers, which is wonderful, but having formalized peer support groups and formalized peer support. So obviously in these last 30 years, we're working in the mental health system, obviously still in consumer-run programs. There are consumer survivors and mental health management level jobs. There are, I know in California and Riverside, the percentage of consumers in that county is incredible, and in every single level, from supervisors to supervisors of supervisors to peer providers, in every level and every kind of program. Very, very, very sophisticated. Huge growth in consumer peer support programs. I have some of the old Madness networks with me. They are coming apart. But I just want to give you a visual of this. This is one page. Oh, it is really coming apart, and this will probably do it. Yeah, it almost did. It's one page of all the consumer-run peer support programs internationally. I'm not sure when this was. It could have been late 1970s or something like that. And now there are 3 or 5 technical assistance centers just to keep track of the amount of consumer-run programs and peer support programs or to help them grow. Also, incorporation of consumer-run peer support programs into the system, such as recovery wellness centers, peer support specialists, peer certification, Medi-Cal-funded peer support. We would not have even envisioned those things at that time. We did envision consumer-run programs, but not in the manner that they look like today. As a peer certification is implemented in 34 states. I think it's 44 states now. And of course, I'm from California. It's not one of the 44. But we're working on that. multiple training opportunities. And what is so fascinating to me is in the 1980s, we started going to conferences and trainings opened up to us, and mental health system and community programs were funding us to go to these conferences and trainings, but they were always put on by other people. There were trainings created by other people. And now, instead of all these multiple training opportunities created by other people, we have developed our own trainings, such as RAP, or emotional CPR, or I'm going to call out Riverside again. I was just at the display, at your display room, and Angela Abbott, who works for Riverside, she just showed me, I just created a curriculum called Co-occurring Life of Recovery. I mean, that's what we're doing now. We're creating our own curriculums, our own trainings. There is really meaningful involvement at most levels of the mental health system, and actually it's required now. In most states, it's actually required that you have to have consumers at the table. You have to involve the input of consumers in decision-making and program development. We really have learned how to participate and partner with other constituency groups. And that can be difficult, and that was a difficult lesson of people that you might really disagree on some issues, that you can work on other issues, and you have to be able to do that. There's now research, once programs develop and they're implemented and they're working, then there's research on consumer-run programs, and not only research by other people, but there are a growing group of wonderful young consumer researchers today. One of the pioneers is Jean Campbell, who literally pioneered so much that consumer-run programs are now an evidence-based practice from her basic research. She's a consumer. We really are working with policymakers to legislate and influence policy. I mean, we are in the halls of power all the time, talking to legislators. It could be locally, it could be statewide, but we're there. Just think of it like we're sitting in campgrounds envisioning these things, standing outside the halls with placards saying we've got to be part of the decision making. And now we're talking to legislators and boards of supervisors and city council people to get the changes that we want. We've really developed new models, such as peer-run respite centers that are growing around the country. And I expect in the next 4 or 5 years will be there'll be many more of them, which is a way of avoiding hospitalization, which is a way of really providing peer support in emergency crisis moments. I mean, it's just expanding peer support to crisis times, 24/7. What is important to me, for me, one of the biggest achievements or changes is those people that sat in those campgrounds were all white. They were white, sort of hippie kids. They were not rich kids. They were on Social Security, general assistance. They'd all been diagnosed, but it was not a diverse movement. And I can speak at least to California. And to my area where I live, most of the people, most of the consumers, most of the activists do not look like me. And I think that is an incredible thing of our movement expanding and being diverse and representing the thousands of people from all kinds of diverse backgrounds and ethnicities that have been diagnosed with mental illness. I mean, that is something that is really important. There's a national coalition of mental health recovery, a national organization that represents us in terms of advocacy and policy issues in Washington. And us, the National Association of Peer Supporters, representing the peer supporters across internationally. What I also think is important that we've learned how important advocacy is wherever it is demonstrated, whether it's outside with placards, whether it's at a day at the Capitol for clients meeting their legislators, or whether it's inside advocacy, whether it's people on management level that are inside the mental health system pushing for change. We need both, and we have to really respect both. So I hope advocacy makes a difference. Advocacy made a difference. And I really do believe that it's client leadership that's going to lead to real transformation, that ongoing, permanent transformation, peer leadership. Excuse me. Evidence of culture change and evidence of advocacy. I'm sorry to talk that much about California, but it's the place that I know. There is a Mental Health Services Act there that is basically responsible for almost all the community programs and outpatient programs in the state. And it was a proposition, stemmed from a proposition called 63 that the people of California voted for. It's a law, the Mental Health Services Act. And in it promotes voluntary services. In fact, that services have to be designed to be voluntary is their regulation language. It promotes peer support and self-help programs. There's language literally in it that every county has to have a peer support client-run program, and if they have them, they have to grow them. Involves consumers at all levels of the mental health system. It's mandated. There has to be a stakeholder process to develop and create programs. It involves this is really important, consumers as part of and a training of the mental health workforce. It's one of their 5 or 6 bullet points under their workforce education plan, and that's one of them. And it puts recovery as a goal. I mean, what a deal. I mean, that, here I'm looking at this Mental Health Services Act, and implicitly or explicitly, everything that we talked about 40 years ago is in this Mental Health Services Act. That's advocacy. That's those small group of dedicated, thoughtful citizens that wanted to make a change, that grew and grew. As we talked about the things that have changed, recovery has replaced maintenance as a goal of people diagnosed with mental illness. There was a new Freedom Commission commissioned by the President of the United States, which was Bush at the time, was Republican president. And part of their vision is that we envision a future when everyone with a mental illness will recover. That would not have happened 40 years ago or 30 years ago or even 20 years ago. Pat also said a few days ago, just that people get better when they advocate. I mean, that's just a given. And I remember my realization that my initial goal was really to advocate for others, that I wanted to do whatever I could so people would not experience what I had experienced in the mental health system. As I said, I've heard that repeated over and over again over the decades. But then realized didn't take too long to realize that in the very process of doing what I was doing, I was really freeing myself and advocating for myself and creating a whole new human being. I mean, I empowered myself from my advocacy for the last 40 years. And I'm not just even talking about the skills I've learned. I'm talking about my self-value. We have really redefined ourselves individually and collectively by advocating for other people. And finally, there was this sort of odd understanding of something even broader than that. I was asked to speak at a social workers conference, and what am I going to, I'm still from the old days, as you said, mental health system, what am I going to say to social workers? And when I really thought about it is that we are really making the system better for everybody. For everybody that works in the mental health system, for people who do not identify as peers. We are creating a liberating and healing environment for everybody. So, from my vantage point, from it's 40 years that I was involved. It was in 1977 that I went to this conference in Griffith Park in Los Angeles, and felt, oh my God, my life has changed. I'm not alone. I've seen the changes that advocacy has created, and that one group of advocates of the next group and the next group and the next group. Now, the flame is still in me, but the flame is in every single one of you. And we give it to the next generation and the next generation. And there's no doubt in my mind that the scope of the achievements of our past is an indicator of the possibilities of our future, because advocacy works.
It's so interesting to hear Sally recount the history, isn't it? It kind of pulls everything together. When I first, I was at this conference, but I kind of forgot about it until I started listening to her again. And it kind of pulls together our whole history in such a beautiful, personal way, coming from the right voice. And you guys must have had a feeling about that too as you listened.
I found it always helpful to listen to Sally often spoke about the history of the movement, and she had a way of kind of having it make sense, because sometimes I wouldn't think about it, but I do remember in the early days meeting people who felt like we need to tear down all the hospitals and march off into the sunset, and other folks who were starting to think about, well, gee, I'd like a job. And I went to school in social work because I felt like I want to go and change the system, not necessarily tear it all down. And she kind of talks about it, how it really was a progression, and that people in self-help have really shifted the way they interact with the system, maybe even how they feel about treatment, and what they feel their role is in the treatment. And so it's really helpful to see that progression, I think, and also remember, that we need to keep hold of those roots, the truths that, we need to be separate from this, and we need to be separate in some ways from regular treatment. We're peer treatment, we're peer supporters. It's different, and it's human, and it's, relational.
And Sally talked about that, I think, in the beginning, about not being co-opted, staying
Yeah,
being
that's
intimately
huge.
involved, but not being co-opted. Yeah.
Yes, it's the irony. To affect change, you've got to get up close and interact and form those relationships. And yet you've got to be clear enough on your own values and where your boundaries are and where you're not going to give way, that you're also willing to fight at the same time that you're collaborating. I mean, it's a real art. And I think Sally was so successful because she carried those really strong values from the beginning of the movement, and yet she evolved and she grew and changed the way that she did the work. She did sort of start on the outside and work her way into being really an inside leader who was training and shaping whole, huge groups of people to do advocacy work and to do the work of using their voice and their choice in effective ways to change the system. I feel often like I can see that there was change because I feel like I'm kind of a second wave member of the movement, right? The work that was done by the really early advocates made it so that I could come in and think about, well, how can we get more peer support going? Because some of the work was already progressing to that point. So I'm always really grateful for that. That I had an opportunity to focus more on, like, what do we want more of, rather than, I think it takes all types of people to successfully affect change, but I was glad that I got to keep my focus on in the area that I was like most passionate about, which is developing things that work.
Yes, yeah, yeah. It takes different skills at different um ages of the process, it seems like.
Absolutely. Um, can I just share one thing that I see because I know that Sally's statement at the end about how the fire is in all of us now, and that's true to people who are well educated about the movement itself and what's been achieved and what still needs to be worked for. But I'm up here in Oregon teaching intentional peer support, and intentional peer support came out of this movement. Sherry Mead developed the curriculum, and it's so beautifully shaped on all the learning of the suffering and loss of voice, the oppression, the different things that have happened to people in a system that wasn't so supportive. But so we're teaching people, and all these young peers are coming in. People are so eager to get the training, and they love to do the work. But it really strikes me that we do a like an hour and a half on the consumer survivor movement because it's the foundations of the peer support that they're delivering. And yet I'm shocked every time in those classes of 20 to 25 people, most people and sometimes no one has even heard of the movement or knows anything about it. So I think for me, I'm really passionate about keeping the learning from all of this moving into modern awareness because it's beautiful that these young people want to do this work, but I want them to understand why it's so important.
Yes, I agree. You gotta know where your roots are.
Yeah.
Um, do you want to speak to that, Carol? I was gonna add some.
Knowing where your roots are, yeah, I guess I could talk. I think Sally was actually really amazing in her ability to bridge all the different kind of eras of self-help.
Mhm.
Like she
Mm.
wrote for Madness Network News. So she was
Yes.
part of that, early radical organizing and then, kind of moved in, created Berkeley Drop-In Center, and ran that for many years and the California Network mental health clients and really um, kind of moving from fighting the system and tearing it down to, fighting it more legislatively,
Mhm.
and more cordially, I guess,
Yes.
sophisticated, and providing peer support and realizing it's really important to help each other, that we have to help each other and take care of ourselves
Yes.
and
Yes.
just how that sometimes I have felt that recovering and staying well are kind of like the best revenge for
Yes.
the wrongs
Yes.
in the system.
Yeah. That's
They
great.
yeah. So I'm kind of digressing, but I remember being told, um, you're never going to get well. You're always going to have this. They, labeled me schizophrenic at one point. I was always going to be schizophrenic. Maybe I'd have some remission, but I'd always be that way. I'd have to take meds. Maybe I could have like a really kind of marginal, simple job. And they thought they were giving me hope, and it was like, no, I feel like really depressed now that you've shared that with me. Um, and yeah. So that we kind of moved from, I think, all being on benefits to actually moving in and getting paid and working in the system and finding our niches sort
Yeah.
of in the system and yet also trying to stay true to the self-help, what we know works in recovery and staying there and not getting taken over too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Mhm.
And Sally kind of moved through all of that. And I just remember when she was with the Cal Network, she was in Sacramento a lot. So I think she spent a fair amount of time at the Capitol,
Oh
talking
yeah.
to legislators. And I can remember being there with we would call them yellow shirt events where we'd all wear the yellow shirts for the network. And then when, even if one of us got up and spoke in a legislative chamber, there's all these yellow shirts. It looks like there's all these people saying this, and it was very powerful. Um, yeah,
That, yeah.
I still am struck by her courage and her
Yeah. Yeah.
persistence in the face sometimes of just incredible power that takes over and wants to
Well,
squash.
and through all of this, at least the last 10 years, you guys probably could be more accurate than I. She was sick. She was struggling with health, serious health issues. And I didn't notice that it slowed her down much. She just pushed through it. Um, it's,
She,
you know, it's-
She was a tremendous fighter. I mean, her fight, her gumption, her will, her persistence and not giving up. I mean, she did a lot of research and tried some fairly uh, like she took some risks with her treatment, but she fought it and fought it hard. She was like, I'm gonna kick this damn cancer's butt. I'm not,
yes.
she was not laying down for it. She
Yeah.
did have to take some time out. There were times where I had to step into doing different things for the network or in Alameda County, even because she of course did have some recovery periods, but she always got back up
Yeah.
strong and clear.
And she was a real inspiration to me because when she was going through some of her sickest times, I was really struggling with blood clots in my lungs and major surgery and brain bleeds and so forth. And I'd see Sally at either a workshop or we consulted at the same place for a while. And we'd look at each other and she'd say, well, we're still here. I,
Uh,
yeah, we're still here, Sally.
my story about that is she got diagnosed, I think it was like in either late 2004 or 2005, and I applied for a job at the city of Berkeley. And Sally, had been in Berkeley for years, right? I didn't put her down as a reference, and she found out about it. And she was furious. She said, why didn't you put me down as a reference? And I said, you just got diagnosed. I thought you wouldn't be feeling well. I didn't really want to bother you. And she
Yeah.
said, don't ever think I am done till I'm done.
Yeah.
And I still think sometimes she's out there watching us, you know.
Yes. Oh, I'm sure of that.
Yeah, yeah.
yes.
Well, you two have been really strong supports for each other too, haven't you? You might want to talk a little bit about that peer support that goes on.
I mean, it is funny because Carol's and my lives and work has kind of woven in and out of connection from that first time that I was in Santa Cruz asking for help with developing a peer support training to, gosh, I'm trying to think. We knew each other through the network. I think through the work with the California network is probably what brought us closer together. But then I moved up to, gosh, I don't know. Maybe you can help me with this, Carol, but I can say this. Carol has done some innovative work as a sound healer. I hope it's okay if I share that, Carol. But one thing that has been very helpful to me sometimes when I've been struggling with staying grounded or processing some of the traumatic stuff that I still have to work on from time to time, she has been really like just such a blessing to me in the way that she has been willing to share her sound healing gifts. But just, we're like two friends who can just pick up the phone and pick up where we left off, even if it's been a very long time.
That's very true. And I remember when I was having trouble working at the city, I went and I kind of called them on some of the stigma that was happening. But, it's like when you're in it, it is kind of, it's toxic, it's like a toxic soup. And so they said, well, do you know anybody who could do a training on this? And I said, oh, yes, Karen, and it was just so fabulous because I just felt rescued at that point because it was, you know, only one, working in mental health out as a mental patient. And so you came in and you were no nonsense, and I could tell the leadership changed because of that. And
Wow.
huge,
Thank you.
yeah, I could have I could have gone crashing down in flames, you know, had not
It,
that. Yeah.
yeah, it gets so frustrating, but yeah, that's wonderful. I've just always loved training is like a passion,
Well, I
probably
just
for all of us.
want to thank you both so much for being a part of this. Um, when I first thought about doing this, I thought about just showing, the recording with Sally. And I thought, gosh, it'd be so much better if some of her colleagues could join in and participate. So thank you ever so much. Really appreciate it. And
Such an honor to keep the legacy of Sally alive. I mean, I just will always carry her in my heart, but I hope that people don't forget the amazing work that she accomplished.
we're going to make sure that doesn't happen.
Right.
Okay. Thank you so much. So appreciate your time and your heartfelt participation so much. So take care.
And so what we'd like to do, Sally it was brilliant, Sally, when you talked about the light within you and seeing the light within everybody else, because it was just what we needed to start this off. Okay. So if our new certified peer specialists and newly employed specialists would all turn your candles on. And if we could dim the lights, please. And now each specialist will wait till they come